So I'm sure you saw last week President Trump released documents about UFOs and aliens. Now, as a big fan of Star Wars, Star Trek, E.T., Flight of the Navigator, I think this stuff can be really cool to think about, but there are also a lot of questions that come up, especially if you're a Christian. And one of the things that we talk about at Rooted Faith Church is allowing the Bible to shape the way that we understand the world. And that's actually one of our goals, is to see the world from the perspective of the Bible, which means we want a biblical worldview about everything, including the question, are there space aliens like the ones in Mars Attacks who are coming to get us just like they got Jack Nicholson? So before we dive into that question, we need to get clear on what we mean by the word alien. Now, when I say alien, I don't mean intelligent, non-human life. Now, as a Christian, I believe there is intelligent, non-human life. And I'll give you 3 examples. The first is animals. You know, animals are a form of non-human life, and animals have a level of intelligence, which is plainly obvious for all of us to see. Now, a second example of intelligent, non-human life would be spiritual beings, particularly angels and demons. You know, those are intelligent, non-human forms of life. And finally, as a Christian, I believe the greatest example of intelligent, non-human life is God himself. And so there's something important here for Christians to know. As a Christian, when I say there are no such things as aliens, I'm not saying there's no such thing as intelligent, non-human life. In fact, intelligent, non-human life is a big part of a biblical worldview. And so when we hear the word alien, the typical image that comes to mind is some sort of green, otherworldly being with big eyes who can do all sorts of things just like us: walk, talk, think, make decisions, fly spaceships, and shoot ray guns. Now, so it seems like what we really mean when we say alien is a morally responsible being who is also a physical being, who comes from a different planet, solar system, or galaxy. And if that's what we mean by alien, then I don't believe there are aliens. And so let me say the same thing a bit more clearly. I don't believe that God has created other morally responsible beings who are also physical beings who come from different planets, solar systems, or galaxies. And before I tell you why, it's important to understand that God could have created beings just like that. You know, God could have created morally responsible beings who are also physical beings, who come from a different planet, they eat different foods, they have a different body type, speak different languages, have green skin. Like, nothing about that idea contradicts the Christian belief in the triune God of all creation. He alone is the creator God, he is life itself, and he has the power to do so, which includes creating all sorts of different kinds of beings on all sorts of different kinds of planets. However, the existence of aliens does seem to be inconsistent with a biblical worldview. And what I mean by that is that I don't believe there are aliens, not because God doesn't have the power to create aliens. Instead, I don't believe there are aliens because I don't believe they fit in a biblical worldview. And so let me tell you why I don't believe they fit in a biblical worldview. First, the Bible distinguishes between the creation and the earth. And the creation includes the entire physical universe. I mean, things like galaxies and solar systems and planets, stars, laws of thermodynamics, and all sorts of things. You know, God created everything. In contrast, the earth is the place that God has uniquely created for human beings. Now, second, the Bible teaches that human beings alone have this unique honor of reflecting God's image. Now, part of the honor given to human beings was to rule and to steward the entire creation, meaning the entire physical universe. Our job was to rule and to steward the entire creation as God's representatives. And so what this means is that human beings actually have an elevated status in the entire universe. We're not just one small part of a larger puzzle. Human beings were intended to play a transformative role in the entire universe itself. Now, you probably know the story. The first human beings, Adam and Eve, did not live into their role as God intended. And as a result, the entire creation, meaning the entire physical universe, has been affected by human sinfulness, so much so that it's not presently as God has intended it to be. Now, in the storyline of the Bible, this is a really big problem, but God has revealed to us through the pages of the Bible that he's been working to restore the entire creation to its former glory. And that story culminates with Jesus Christ, who is both fully God and fully human. And so check this out. Listen what the Bible has to say. It says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And so Jesus is the source of life, of the entire creation, of the entire universe. The Bible continues. It says this: he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, which is a summary statement of everything there is, by making peace through the blood of his cross. And so Jesus is the source of new life, the new creation that God is moving the entire universe towards. Okay, so how does this tie together into a conversation about aliens? Well, let's think about this from a biblical worldview. Number one, God has created everything, which includes all life. Number two, everything in the physical universe that God has created has been affected by human sinfulness. Not some of it, not most of it, all of it. The entire creation has been affected by our sin. Now, if the entire creation has been affected by human sinfulness, then that means aliens, these morally responsible beings who are also physical beings, who come from different planets and solar systems and galaxies, are affected negatively by our mistakes. And so that means morally responsible beings who God created are being held morally responsible for something they didn't do. And that just seems to be unjust. And here's where it gets even trickier, because God is the one who holds them morally responsible for something they didn't do, then God is actually the source of that injustice. But as Christians, we believe that God is justice itself, which means when he acts completely consistent with the standards of his own character. In other words, God cannot act unjustly. And so here's what this all boils down to. Human sinfulness affects every part of the physical universe. If they are aliens, then they are being held morally responsible for human sinfulness. But God will not hold morally responsible beings morally responsible for something they didn't do. And so therefore, there are no aliens. Now here's how someone could respond to this problem. Someone could say, well, what if the effects of human sinfulness were somehow contained to the earth? Sort of like the ozone layer contains oxygen. Maybe there's this invisible force that contains human sinfulness to the earth. And so that way, if there are aliens out there in the universe somewhere, then they wouldn't be forced to live under the effects of human sinfulness. And I think that's a pretty neat answer, but it actually has two problems. First, it makes sin something physical, something that can be contained to a physical space. And that's not what the Bible has in mind when it talks about sin. And second, it means that there are places in the physical universe that are sin-free. And so when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped foot on the moon, they were possibly in a sin-free zone. And that just doesn't make much sense from a biblical worldview, because sin isn't something physical. It can't be contained to a physical space. Instead, sin is non-physical. It's spiritual. And yet it saturates the entire creation. And so then where does this leave us with this idea of aliens? Well, my guess is that it's an idea that's at home in a different worldview. The belief that there are these morally responsible beings who are also physical beings, who come from a different planet, a different solar system, a different galaxy, it seems to be more consistent with an evolutionary worldview. And that's the idea that all life has evolved from organic matter over long periods of time, rather than at home in a biblical worldview. And that seems to me to be where the real conversation should be happening. What worldview makes the best sense of the evidence available to us? I believe that the worldview of the Bible makes the best sense. And as Christians, it's our job to help people to understand the world from the perspective of the Bible. And these are actually the kinds of things that we talk about at Rooted Faith Church. Our vision is to see every person rooted in Christ and growing in faith. And our mission is to create environments where faith can take root. And so if you'd like to know more about us, I encourage you to check out our social media at Rooted Faith Church, or come visit us some Sunday morning. We gather at 10 a.m. in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. We'd love to have you and to get to know you.